Those at the back, you all can hear me, right? On both sides? Okay, perfect. At least that is working today. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really overwhelmed that such a lot of people turned out to what some call a very boring subject. I mean, it's 19th century newspapers. Now, when I collected all these newspapers and brought them home, I was nicknamed as the Botal Pattarakarya. Sometimes I went to Kandy, I think Buddhika knows there, went to Professor K.M. De Silva's house and collected all this material for this over the last 6 months. But it was really a labor of love that I really appreciate in putting out this talk. I came up with this subject because I came across a very interesting set of paper cuttings which was owned by a person called L.E. Blasse. Those in Kandy would know L.E. Blasse as the founder of Kingswood College. And he was a historian who wrote about a book called The Short History of Sri Lanka, which was used as an unofficial text for the students of the country about the country's history. And this book, Paper Cuttings of the L.E. Blasse collection on newspapers, had something rather very interesting. And it was a pamphlet which really surprised me, which had the name the Ceylon Journal, published in 1894. Now, we had this launch, I think about half of you came for that launch in 2024 August, and I can remember somewhere there, I'm not sure whether that gentleman is there today, he asked me, is this a revival of an ancient journal which has ceased to exist? And I said no, because my editorial team and I, we made sure that there was nobody who had used the Ceylon Journal earlier, but the name sounded quite old and seasoned, and it's fair that one would suspect that the word Ceylon Journal was used earlier. That being said, as I opened this pamphlet, I was really surprised that it had this sort of information. Diagonally you can see it says the Ceylon Journal, and I don't know whether you can clearly see, it says the Ceylon Journal will be circulated all over the world. And it is the cheapest journal in the country at that time. It has subjects related to current affairs, history, art, and very similar things that we in 2024 had with our Ceylon Journal. But for some reason, the Ceylon Journal on your left, the 1894 one, never came out. And we, my team over there, who had no understanding that there was a people who were trying to put out a journal with the same name, we did the same thing unknowingly. And we also, Mr. Dilima is also here, we know that we've been circulating this all around the world, I think across about 7 or 8 countries. At the end, I will give you the statistics of how we have performed since 2024 July. And this really made me think, what was the situation of the country's press? And when I say press, it doesn't mean just the newspapers, it certainly means also of the periodicals, even school magazines, then professional associations. I think even the SLMA has their own magazine, the Sri Lanka Medical Journal. I think the office of it is right at the bottom, so I'm right now standing on history. So that being said, we will, first of all, I hope to talk for about 40 minutes. It's a wide subject, so bear with me. And I will be selecting only a few number of journals and newspapers. Otherwise, Sampath Bank will have to sponsor another couple of days of events like this. And it's only a selected number of journals in English, not Sinhala and Tamil. And journals centered around Colombo, some in Kandy as well, and only of the 19th century. So I will be setting my limit to that scope. Now that being said, if we think very carefully, what is the importance of printing and publishing? It's a very important question. Now if I ask you, what was the King of England 500 years ago eating? There is a record of it. I think it was the Elizabethan era, Henry VIII, whatever. I'm not very good with my British history, but there is a record of it. But in Sri Lanka, we have hardly any understanding, even the date of birth of a king who was born 300 years ago. Our record keeping, I'm not saying it was poor. Of course, we have to consider the fact that we had wars and that the fact that things were stolen or destroyed over the years. But we did not have journals or periodicals or newspapers before the British period. It was the Dutch who first brought the printing machine to Sri Lanka, and the only thing they did was printing hymn books for the Dutch Reformed Church, or Bibles, or Dutch placards telling things not to do. And it was the British who really brought it. But if you think carefully, printing and publishing, the art of books, it is the most important invention. And this quotation I have taken from the book Early Typography. It was written by the first government printer, William Skene. You can read it along with me. It says, "Printing and publishing is noble because it is the nurse and preserver of all the other arts and sciences, and is unquestionably the most important as well as the most beneficial invention the world has ever seen." Now here's why. It is the disseminator of every other discovery, the commemorator of all the other inventions. It hands down to posterity every important event, immortalizes the actions of the great and the good. So because of a newspaper, we have the understanding of what happens in terms of the administration, in terms of achievements of people or the country, to even matters that once were considered trivial, right? So that being said, I want to ask you a question. Now, I'm not doing a promotion for the Sunday Island or anything. This is just a random newspaper I found at home. Why are newspapers so big? Why can't it be something as simple as this? I'm not promoting my journal here. It's just the easiest thing I found around. Why is it so big? I mean, after a newspaper is read, unless you collect it, you use it to, wrap something like food or whatnot. No? I think there are a lot of doctors here, they will advise you not to do that. But the reason is, this is what I found, that back in the day, probably in the Victorian period, there was a tax for the number of pages in a newspaper. But there was no rule saying what size the page can be. So what the clever people of that time did, they combined 4 sheets, probably what we call A4 today, and put out one particular size. And that's the same size even to this date we use. And I don't think there is a tax like that in the country, but that's a practice that has been continued till this date. Now saying that, the first government publication of Sri Lanka at that time was the Government Gazette. Right? The Government Gazette started around the year 1802. It was priced at 2 rix dollars. Now don't ask me what is a rix dollar, it's a Dutch currency. I think the raffle draw book today is about currency, and we also have Professor Paranavitano, who is the proponent of the Dutch period. We can ask him what rix dollars are, but it was only 2 rix dollars. And it came out, I think, once a week. And it, according to ECB Wijerama, one of the great journalists of Lake House, he says that this was the chronicling of dull official notifications and announcements of marriage and deaths of well-known people. Nothing much has changed after 200 years. Right? And it didn't have editorials like we have today, but certainly with years to come, the Gazette became a more readable text. The governors, I think Brown, Rigg and Barnes and Paget, they made it more feature heavy. There were supplements, and they created a supplement to the Ceylon Government Gazette, which was like a collection of articles like what we have in the Ceylon Journal on politics, religion and so on, and also about poetry, which I think is the earliest record of Sri Lanka's, I don't think it was necessarily written by indigenous people, but the earliest record of poetry comes in the Gazette. And these are things many scholars could really look into in the days to come. And the first governor who really understood the importance of the concept of newspapers was Robert Wilmot Horton. Right? At least Horton Place is named after him. Now you know that he started the first newspaper. And he also established a famous school, which I will talk in a few minutes. So this first newspaper was called the Colombo Journal. And it came again once a week, later it became twice a week. And the whole outlook of the Colombo Journal seems very liberal. it was a bit anti-British at the start. And one wondered, why is the governor putting a newspaper that was not totally promoting his own interest? But to see Governor Horton was playing a different game. He was fighting a case against his own government because he was in the opposition party, and he used his own colony's newspaper against it. And what happened was the Home Office, I have written this in my article, they sent him a warning to immediately seize this newspaper. And the Colombo Journal, it's a lovely name, it ended exactly 1.5 or maybe 2 years after it first came. But Governor Horton didn't stop there. He used the civil servants to start another newspaper, and he contributed using anonymous names, and that also got caught. That was called the Ceylon Chronicle, and this time the governor had to leave the country. Right? So likewise, there are so many newspapers that came and went, but the key number of years you all have to remember is 2 years. That was the average lifespan of a newspaper or a journal at that time. Now from newspapers, I will shift to periodicals and journals, because this was a time newspapers was not that in trend. And the first people who understood that was the missionaries. And this was the first journal. This is a AI generated image. We have not found any copy of this particular journal. It was called Tyro's Repository of Useful Knowledge. Now I haven't seen it, and I have no idea what it initially contained, but I know for a fact it was edited by a missionary called Samuel Lambrick around the year 1833, and it ended exactly 2 years in 1834. And in his editorial, which I quoted from a different journal called the Ceylon Miscellany, he gives the reason for this publication: to address the idlers of an ignorant generation. And that being said, that also ended in just under 2 years. And then there were many missionary journals. The Anglicans put out their own stuff. The Wesleyan missionaries put their own journals. And they were not really feature-like journals, but mostly Christian evangelical things. And one person was Benjamin Bailey. Those who have followed his poetry know how important he was in the early British period. So we had magazines like that, and throughout the 1830s, like journals would come and go mainly on Christian subjects. But there was one journal that for the first time, though it was a Christian origin, called The Friend, it slowly started to talk about temporal affairs, about literature for a start. And The Friend had two amazing editors. The first one was Robert Spence Hardy, and the other was Daniel Goggoley, who is the foremost Buddhist scholar of that period. And they took out religion out of the scene for a while and started talking about literature. And then this interested people, and slowly subscribers started to come. And Professor Yasmin Gunratne, in her book English Literature of Ceylon, says that this was the first time people in the country were acquainted with the English language. That this was the time people were slowly understanding that it's important to get into public service and you should know English, and this was like the first text available for them to be acquainted with that language. Now, a question for you all. Are there any royalists here? There's quite a few, right. So you all have the unique record of being the first school to have a periodical or a journal. And it was called the Colombo Academy Miscellany and Juvenile Repository. Yeah. And this was edited by the principal itself. I haven't come across copies of it, but I think the Colombo Academy is Royal College. Royal College claims that they have kept one copy of this in their archive. But the reason why they stopped is more interesting than anything else. And this is what the history of Royal College in 1932 says why it stopped. The editors saw no reason why the magazine should be published when a better of self-education was afforded by the college library. And for the next 40-50 years, Royal College did not have any magazines or journals. I think that's the time St. Thomas's College started to make its way. And also another important school called St. Joseph's College, which happens to be my school. Now, the Ceylon magazine, that's a very interesting name for its time, it was the first magazine that completely dropped religion out of the equation. And it was mainly speaking about history, politics, native practices, even demon practices were mentioned in this. And what is fortunate that we have digital copies of this online. It was again, now this was the first one that went over 2 years, Ceylon magazine. But it was much ahead of its time. It didn't have the right sort of readership that could sustain it. But there was a very capable editor called John Capper who came to our country in the guise of plantation and business, but he got into politics. And once he got into politics, he knew to sustain his activities. Having a journal or a newspaper is also a good idea, which is something we have seen in modern day politics, where politicians own newspapers and have different business activities. That being said, the Ceylon magazine had 196 subscribers, including the governor at that time, which I think 196 at any day or age of Sri Lanka is a good number. But that being said, just after 4 years, this also had an early death. Now, there is one more missionary journal which I think is very important. It was called The Investigator, and if there's anybody from Kandy, you all can be happy. This came from Kandy, the Baptist missionaries from Kandy. They had a different outlook. They used this journal to start keeping the government in check. And it was the first journal ever that really started questioning the activities of the plantation workers, the coffee trade and all that. And it was so much of bother for the government, they started sending letters to the missionaries in England telling to stop funding this. Speaking of press democracy, this is a clear example where that didn't exist at that time. And exactly a year after it, due to inadequate funds, this journal stopped, never to rise again. Now that being said, until 1850, we had 19 journals in Sri Lanka, out of which only one is in existence. Can somebody tell me what that journal is? The Royal Asiatic Journal, right? I can see the president of the Royal Asiatic Society is also there. And I'm also a member of the Royal Asiatic Society. This organization started in 1845, and it was the first journal in the country that had a more scientific outlook on the content it created. And the best scholars of that period, archaeologists, historians, civil servants, even writers, they came together and they gave talks at the Royal Asiatic Society. And whatever that was important of those talks, in a scientific way, they peer-reviewed it and published it. And I think for 180 odd years, the Ceylon, which is called today the Royal Asiatic Society Journal of Sri Lanka, has created a very important mark in our country's history and periodicals. Now, if I go on to speak about journals in the next few decades, it's going to take a long time, but I will just speak about 4 journals which I think are very important in understanding the press of that time. Now, Young Ceylon, which I think you all would remember, is the journal that inspired us to start the Ceylon Journal, was the first journal that the natives of the country managed. And most of these editors of it were young students who were from Royal College. I think they were fed up with that, what the principal said with the library. They wanted to start their own journal. And then the main person who promoted this was Charles Ambrose Lawrence. And Young Ceylon, I think there are copies of it in Peradeniya, and also I found the scan I have taken is from the State Library of Canberra. It's a very interesting journal. And it was the first journal that started speaking about the Ceylonese identity. And before that, the word Ceylonese, which we today translate as Sri Lankan, was hardly used. And people like Lawrence and then James D. Alvis, Richard Morgan, Louis Nell, they started to be a bunch of liberal thinkers, which was much ahead of that time. And one could argue this was the start where people started to talk about self-rule, which was the first step towards independence. And also we had many journals of humor. Now Muniandi was the best out of them. It was completely cartoons, caricatures, satirizing the politicians of that day. Sometimes it even ridiculed Queen Victoria and her sons. Sometimes even the Kalusuddas, like the Mahamudlias, I won't mention the surnames, they're all around here. They were also ridiculed, right? And sometimes the people who were employed in this were government servants. They used pseudonyms. And the foremost artist who contributed ridiculing and promoting the interest of this journal was J.L.K. Van Dort, who I think was the best artist of the 19th century. And the next journal I'm going to talk very briefly is something I'm a bit jealous of, The Orientalist. Again, something that came in Kandy. The reason I'm a bit jealous is I thought in 2024 I was the youngest person to start a journal, but no. This man started slightly younger than me when he was 24. I was 25. And The Orientalist, nobody talks about it today. I think it's a great journal because it, just like the Royal Asiatic, it got a lot of people and it had regular talks in Kandy and Batticaloa and so on. And the person who started it, William Gunathilaka, he was one of the best lawyers in Kandy at that time. And he got a bunch of scholars like the translator of the Mahavansa Mudliya Vijay Singha, then H.C.P. Bell, the Muslim freedom fighter Siddhi Lebbe, J.P. Lewis, Henry Parker, and he had a wide gamut of writers who are very old and very young, just like the Ceylon Journal. But that being said, 6 years later, William Gunathilaka got a chance to go to Thailand, and he migrated, and he started his own law firm. I think Tilake and Company, something like that, which is still there. And just before he died, he was the Attorney General for Thailand, and I think he made much of a name there, and today nobody in this country talks about William Gunathilaka or The Orientalist. Again, copies of this is available online. It's worth reading and amplifying the knowledge of that period. And the last journal I'll be talking today is something very, very important because it was something done by one person, a person called Hugh Neville of the Ceylon Civil Service. Now, Hugh Neville is a very underrated, misunderstood, and sometimes a much ridiculed figure. And one may know that he has contributed to the biggest collection of palm leaf manuscripts in the British Library. Now, Hugh Neville, though he was a civil servant, he did everything what this journal is talking about. Now, this is the full name of the journal. The Taprobanian, a Dravidian journal of Oriental studies in and around Ceylon in natural history, archaeology, philology, and history, and many other subjects. But funny enough, he was the editor of it, and most of the articles were also written by him. And he had to find funding for it, and ultimately he had no one to support him, and this also unfortunately had a natural death. But I think this journal speaks about the earliest discoveries of the native practices, about archaeology, about, I think Pradeep Jayatunga wrote about the Nittavos based on early findings of the Taprobanian. I think it's a journal that must really have a closer look by scholars and enthusiasts in this field. And that being said, we are coming to newspapers. But trust me, we don't have a lot of newspapers, just about 5 or 6 in this period I have highlighted, 1834 to 1900. Now, in Sri Lanka, we had many journals at the start that came out and didn't last for more than 2 years. But this was a period where the scholars knew getting the plantation work economy, the plantation owners and the business magnates would be a good idea to start a newspaper because at least they will have the enough necessary funds for it. And the first newspaper that came out with that sort of idea was the Ceylon Observer and the Commercial Advertiser. And it started in Independence Day. At that time there was no independence, but February 4th, 1834, a group of businessmen started it. And it was, I would say, the first modern newspaper of Sri Lanka. Now what's interesting is, this newspaper had financial issues, and an Irish doctor called Christopher Eliot. Christopher Eliot lived in the Temple Trees. He was the person who built the Temple Trees. One of the best, I would say, supporters of the Sri Lankan cause. He became the editor and the owner of the Ceylon Observer. And he made this newspaper perhaps the most pro-native newspaper that represented the true needs of the people in a colonial time period. And the greatest time where this was tested was during the 1848 rebellion. Now you all have learned in school that 1848 rebellion, obviously the natives lost. but it's a highly exaggerated story. Nobody attacked or killed any British person, but the governor at that time, Viscount Torrington, he had numerous executions, some under martial law, and that were illegal. But what Dr. Eliot did was, he and his team clearly started to represent the needs of the people, and this started to raise questions in the House of Lords on how the conduct of the Ceylon government was happening. And they started to fix an important committee, including prime ministers in England like Robert Peel, then Gladstone, Disraeli, and they found out that our governor was not doing things right here, and they recalled him. This is something that is less talked in history. And this was one occasion where the press really represented and won the case in favor of the natives of that time. And after Eliot's era in the Observer came the Fergusons. A.M. Ferguson and John Ferguson. They were uncle and nephew. And they made the Observer a very profitable, very reader-friendly newspaper. And if you all heard, you all should be knowing this more than me, the Ferguson Directories was a practice they started, which had almost all the necessary information from cities to towns to whatever of that period. And after they moved out of one more thing I want to mention, the Observer also started the pigeon mail in Sri Lanka, from Galle to Chilau, because we didn't have telephones or telegrams or whatever at that time. That was something the Fergusons started. And after the Fergusons were out of the Observer, that is when our D.R. Wijerama purchased the Observer and made it a part of Lake House, and by that time he had the Dinamina and the Daily News, and it was a very powerful organization. But you may remember in 1973, the government of Mrs. Sirimao Bandaranayake took over Lake House, and the Ceylon Observer was also taken over. And unfortunately, which was just 40 years ago, the Ceylon Observer ended. And it's a newspaper that should have continued to this date. Today we talk about the Sunday Observer, but the Ceylon Observer was a daily paper that had a lot of things on the arts and the culture of that time. Fortunately, most of these newspapers are preserved at the National Archives. Some have been even digitized. So you are more than free to have a look at them. Then the other newspaper, while the Observer was batting for the people of this country, the newspaper that was pro-government, pro-colonial, was John Capper's Times of Ceylon, which was initially called the Ceylon Times. They later rebranded it because Times of Ceylon sounded much better. The Times of Ceylon, though it was pro-government, John Capper was he was a double game person. He was in the Legislative Council defending the people, but his newspaper was pro-government. A very interesting thing. And but what is important is the Times of Ceylon was the most commercially successful newspaper at that time, and it had supplements in called the Illustrated Sunday Times of Ceylon, which was, I would say, one of the most pivotal moments in our Sri Lanka's literature and art scene. And speaking about where it existed, this is where today the Bowers building in Chatham Street was there. That was where the old Times of Ceylon was located. And these were Dutch houses. They have been demolished. And later the Times of Ceylon under the Cappers shifted to Bristol Street. And this continued, I think, till the 30s, 40s, until the Times of Ceylon had so much of money, they built one of the biggest structures in the country at that time. Can somebody tell me what this building is today? It's there. It's the customs building. Yeah. Because what happened, the Times of Ceylon was also a government entity, and I would say one of the best papers of that time, and throughout its history, it had a lot on the politics and the literature and as well as the arts of that period, but the government couldn't control it. And it was declared bankrupt by 1985, and at that time President Jayawardena sold the rights of it to his cousin Ranjit Wijewardena, but Times of Ceylon was never used. It was, the daily paper came later as the Daily Mirror, and later the Sunday paper is called the Sunday Times. Of course we have Lankadeep and the Tamil papers as well. Now, saying that, press rivalry. I'm sure there are journalists here, I saw many had registered. Just like you all had rivalry now, there was a rivalry between pressers on their policies at that time. And at that time, the main rivalry, this is an AI generated image, the editors never engaged in duels. The Times of Ceylon and the Observer were the main people who had a rivalry. But this was a rivalry mainly between John Capper and A.M. Ferguson. And this is one example I found while reading the newspapers of that period. On one occasion, at the arrival of the Prince of Wales, who later became Edward VII of England, to Kandy in 1875, the Observer published a graphic report in connection with the following rites. Now, this was written by the editor A.M. Ferguson. He says, the chaste Rhodia maiden bared her breast and waved her handkerchief as the prince passed. Now, John Capper was waiting for a line like this, and the next day in the Times of Ceylon, he wrote this: we have no doubt that the maiden was chaste, but how did Mr. Ferguson know that? So there was a bit of wit. Of course, there was no aggression like what we experienced in the last 30, 40 years in this country. And this is another very underrated newspaper, the Ceylon Examiner. It started off as the chief organ of the plantation owners, and it wasn't that profitable because no one was interested in it. And then Charles Ambrose Lawrence, who was one of the wealthiest men in the country, he was also one of our inspirations to start the Ceylon Journal. He and a group of Sinhala and I would say Ceylonese people, they made a syndicate and purchased the Examiner. And they rebranded it as the Ceylon Examiner. And one of the famous things Lawrence did was, he used to draw cartoons, and he himself would publish cartoons of the government officials, from the governor to the bishop or whoever, and write things like in Muniyandi, satirizing them, and really giving the true picture in terms of humor. But sadly, with the death of Lawrence, this newspaper went into financial difficulty, and it was the only independent newspaper, much more independent than the Ceylon Observer, that truly represented the natives in the late part of the 19th century. But by 1900, it had so much of financial constraints, it also ceased to exist. But that being said, a group of Dutch burghers, led by Hector van Culenburg, had a brilliant idea. What they did was, they started a new newspaper called the Ceylon Independent. And they got a fierce liberal Brit called George Wall. George Wall, we featured him in the first issue of the Ceylon Journal. He had a good idea. What he did was, he doubled the circulation, irrespective of the buying power or whatever of the people, and priced the Ceylon Independent as half the price of all of its competitors. So overnight, the Ceylon Independent became the most popular and the most profitable newspaper in the country. But after changing hands, I think even L.E. Blasey was editor of it towards the latter part. I think there was also Christopher Dryburgh. What happened was, the Ceylon Independent was purchased by D.R. Wijerama, and it was merged with the Ceylon Daily News. So that being said, now all these newspapers I've been talking about existed for well over 100 years, except for the Examiner and the Independent, but none of them are in existence today. So what is the oldest surviving English newspaper in the country? Can somebody tell me? The oldest surviving English newspaper in the country. So those of you who haven't heard of it, it's the Ceylon Catholic Messenger. It started in 1869, and it's something that has continued to this day. I think one of the editors of the Messenger, I think Father Felician, was there. In fact, I also made my debut in writing to this paper when I was about 14 or 15. And this newspaper was the organ of the Catholic Church, and it's continued as the organ of the Archdiocese of Colombo. And today, of course, it's famous for different reasons, but back then it was the ideal paper where all the religions put forward their views on educational matters, especially during the school takeover, the nationalization of organizations, hospitals, and so on. So it's a newspaper that has lasted well for over 150 years, serving not just the needs of the Catholics, but of the whole population. So I think I have spoken for well over 40 minutes. And my final question is, why the Ceylon Journal? Why? Now, this is a thing I can't answer in one line or in a few minutes. But the reason why we started it is many journals, many newspapers started in many impulses, mainly to either evangelize or to propagate knowledge, literature, or whatever findings or the current affairs at that time. But in general, we do not have in Sri Lanka a journal that falls in the niche of semi-academic, semi-feature-like. And that's where me and my team decided we should go away with the idea of not being too academic and start the Ceylon Journal. Now, me being a collector and my fellow collectors, I can see a few of them. Praveen is there, Dr. Srilal, then Buddhika. I don't know whether Malaka Talwatta is here. We all thought there's no point being just collectors. We should put all these things together. And we have a wide gamut of subjects which we publish in the Ceylon Journal. It's not just history alone. We talk about politics, about art. I think in the third journal we had about 3 articles written by 3 eminent artists, and something which we really haven't seen in the country in the last 50, 60 years. So that being said, we had a general analysis of how the Ceylon Journal has performed, because Sampath Bank should be also aware of it now after helping us so much. So far, we have done 4 issues, and we have been on time, and we have increased the print run each time, and already the first 2 journals have run out of print. The third one is almost done, that's what I heard. We have still very many copies of the 4th one. In fact, we are launching it today. But what is really interesting is we have published 61 articles so far, which are all peer-reviewed. Articles on Sri Lanka's history, right from the start. You all remember Donald Stadner's article on Adams Peak, Pradeep's article on Nittavo, then in the recent journal about the 2 women caves in Monaragala district, and also my article on populations, how it evolved. This was the pre-modern period. And then the colonial period, and of course the post-modern period, where we have articles like Udita's article on Martin Wickramasinghe, to the article on Richard, forget his name also, Richard Simon. So that being said, we also have articles on archaeology, on politics, on law. I think Mr. Manohara De Silva contributed some very important articles about law to us, which have been well received. We have articles on architecture, on sports, and all in all, we have found 44 unique writers all around the world. And apart from Sri Lankans and the diaspora community, we have found foreign writers in England, in Italy, in Portugal, in the Netherlands, then in USA, and also in Australia, who have contributed to the Ceylon Journal. And already for the 5th one, we have found 15 articles, out of which 8 have already been received by the editorial team. So it's a growing journal that I do not know what the limits are. But I can tell you one thing, that we started a venture that is completely full of responsibility of sources, more than opinion and continuity, rather than having minor ideas in our mind. And that's why the editorial team always has a more diverse sense of understanding history rather than making it popular. So that being said, we talked about the birth of Ceylon's voice. I think all of you have a big role to play in this idea of we going through change in the government, in the society, that we have to make the press a more decent press. Because you know newspapers, how they have ridiculed facts and the truth today. I don't have to name papers, you know that. Not just English, even the Sinhala and Tamil papers, how it has twisted the truths. But did it have the ethics and the decency which we had in the past? So these are questions you can ponder. And thank you so much for showing up today on a busy Saturday evening. And thank you so much.